Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again for another episode, and you are in for a very big treat today because I'm in for a big treat. And that is because we are visiting with lawyer, author, Oklahoman, and a host of other things, James Jennings. So, James, with that incredibly long winded introduction, first of all, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Tom. It's good to be with you.
So, when I got to something from your PR firm or whoever was representing you about your book, I could not believe a trial lawyer writing novels in Oklahoma City who's Chickasaw, or at least part Chickasaw. And then I communicated with whoever that person was, and they said, he doesn't write about compliance. I said, I don't care. This is a man I have to talk to. And I've really been looking forward to this interview. So I've set up a little bit about your background. Could you tell us professionally what you have done in your career?
Yes, I've been practicing law for about 50 years. Graduated from the University of Oklahoma Law School in 1974. I can't even remember the year. But I'm a trial lawyer. I've tried a number of lawsuits, a lot of lawsuits actually. Started out as an assistant district attorney in Oklahoma County back in the mid to late 70s. Tried a bunch of criminal cases. Moved over to the civil side in about 1980. Tried a bunch of civil lawsuits through the years, formed the firm that I'm now with called Jennings here in Oklahoma City. And I then found myself about 25 years ago or so moving in the direction of being a novelist, and discovered that being a trial lawyer and being a novelist have much in common. They're actually close kin. They both involve storytelling. And so that's what's led me to this meeting that we're having today.
And frankly, that connection was immediately apparent to me, but I'm gonna take it a step further because when they asked or said he doesn't write about compliance, I said, "Oh, but he does," because he's a storyteller. And in many ways, a corporate compliance officer has to tell stories because perhaps even unlike a general counsel in the corporate setting, all you have is persuasion. All you have is, your ability to get someone to do something without a hammer. And so I try to communicate to corporate compliance officers, you need to tell a story, whatever that story might be around policies and procedures, rules and regulations, or something else. So I really see what you do blending over to the world of what I do as well. But could you tell us a little bit about your Chickasaw heritage?
Yes, I'm a fifth generation Oklahoman. My Chickasaw ancestors came west on the Trail of Tears in 1837. I'm actually equal parts Chickasaw and Choctaw, registered as a Chickasaw citizen. You can only register as one and have ancestry down both those paths. And I'm very proud of my Chickasaw ancestry and have been more and more involved in affairs of the Chickasaw Nation in recent years. I have the pleasure of serving on the board of directors of the Chickasaw Community Bank, which is a $400 million community full service bank headquartered here in Oklahoma City. I'm very much Chickasaw, and as you know from your own ancestry, five civilized tribes are very prominent and forceful entities in the state of Oklahoma, large employers, big financial forces, economic forces in the state. So it's been a pleasure and an honor to have the opportunities that I've had to serve.
Could you tell us a little bit about the cultural heritage of storytelling within the Chickasaw Nation?
Sure, the heritage is the same, largely the same as you would find with any group of people, because we're all storytellers. In every line of work, in every field of endeavor, our source of communication is largely in telling stories. I had the pleasure recently of delivering a paper in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, before the Litigation Council of America. And the subject of the presentation was storytelling in the courtroom and storytelling in novels, fiction, and the comparison of those two. And it turns out they have much in common. And beyond that, it turns out that storytelling is essential to what we do in everyday life. It's our way of understanding the world around us and our way of communicating with each other. I was doing some research in connection with this paper that I was delivering and came across some very enlightening statements from authors like Salman Rushdie and Neil Gaiman. And they both talk about the fact that we are storytelling creatures. We need stories. We use stories to make sense of the world around us. And that's certainly true in the Chickasaw Nation because much of the history has been preserved over the years through storytelling, and in later years was actually documented in writing. But the original source of passing on history was storytelling.
Now let me turn to your legal career and your legal academic and now professional background. And how does that how did that influence your writing or thinking through how to tell a story?
It's interesting, Tom. As I mentioned a moment ago, storytelling in a lawsuit and storytelling in a novel are close kin. They have very much in common. And when I uh, decided to become a novelist, I began to understand and appreciate the closeness of that kinship in a way that I hadn't before. In a trial or in before a jury or in a presentation of any kind before a group, you're largely and to a great extent spinning a yarn, creating a narrative, and that's the way you're communicating with them. That's the way you're presenting whatever proposition you're there to present. That's plainly true in a jury trial, a civil or criminal case. And then when it comes to writing a novel, telling a story of the type you have in a novel, it's the same thing. And the more I learned about writing books, the more I realized that I was perhaps well equipped to do it, or at least had some experience at storytelling because of the experience I had in the practice of law. They're very similar to each other.
As a young associate, I prepared motions, I took depositions, I presented people for deposition, I would occasionally do a hearing. And at that point in my career, I was learning what I would say was the nuts and bolts of being a trial lawyer. And I didn't see a bigger picture or I didn't understand the overall story. And I think maybe about 15 years into my career, I finally had that aha moment where I saw, here's the story. But what I wanted to use that as an introduction to ask you, can a lawyer think through the story they want to tell at the start of the litigation or of the lawsuit, or does it have to develop literally as you develop your case?
Probably both things are occurring. At the outset, you probably have a pretty good idea of where you want to go and what the theme of your case is going to be. And that's pretty much the same thing that occurs when you're writing a novel. You have a pretty good idea of where you're going, what you want the theme of the novel to be, and how you plan to make the point that you're trying to make. But as time goes along, in a lawsuit, you're learning more about the matter which is at issue in the case. In the novel, the characters are developing, the story is developing, and to some extent, the story takes on its own life. And characters in the novel take over and guide the direction of the novel. And so you have to be prepared to adapt to that. But it's important that the central themes of the lawsuit or of the novel be expressed early and that they be developed over time. Science tells us now that in deciding cases, jurors are very quick to make up their minds. And so you need to get out there as quickly as possible and let them know what your truth is and what you're going to do to make it be their truth also.
As a fellow writer, I'm always intrigued by a author's writing process. I've written a lot of books, but they've all been in the nonfiction world, generally business related books. I wanted to maybe ask you about how you develop the concepts for the two novels you have published, Light Most Favorable and Mirador, and talk us through your creative process and tell us a little bit about each of those novels.
And the third novel, which just came out last month, is called Blue Wild Indigo.
Right.
And so there are actually three of them. But where did they come from? They came from the fact that I knew there were themes that I wanted to express in the form of a story, a long form story. And there were places and people and cultures that were of interest to me and that I knew that I wanted to use to go about expressing those themes. The Light Most Favorable is a story that deals with ranching in Arizona in the modern day. My ancestors on the Chickasaw side were horse breeders, ranchers, agrarian people. I had spent a good deal of time in Arizona, and so I have an interest in ranching out there and the issues that they face. I like the place. Lots of the famous old westerns, including the movie Oklahoma, were filmed in the San Rafael Valley, which is where The Light Most Favorable is set. So it actually turns out that place is more like Oklahoma than Oklahoma, I guess. It's a beautiful place, and I wanted this story to be set there. I wanted the theme or theme to be developed and told within the context of modern day ranching. And that's what got me started. And then once you get started, then aspects of your own life enter into the process and blend in. And before you know it, if you stay at it long enough, you'll end up with 100,000 words of a story and a book. The second book was Mirador, which is set in Mexico, has to do with ancient Mayan culture. I had the pleasure to spend a summer in Mexico City when I was in college as a student at the Universidad Iberoamericana in Mexico City. And so I really fell in love with Mexico and its history. And so I knew I wanted to tell a story that was set there and had to do with that ancient culture. Mayan culture is a subject of great interest to people in the US. You see it on TV all the time. And so those two things with respect to each of those two books launched me. And then, of course, the current novel, Blue Wild Indigo, is a ranching story, which is set in Oklahoma. And it's easy to see where that came from. So that's what began the process for me.
Uh, I am a morning person, and I write best in the morning. Do you find that do you have a period of day that you're the most productive, or can you sit down and write it pretty much any time during the day?
Turns out that you and I are close kin, I guess, because I'm a morning person also. I'm much more attentive, much more alert, much more creative early in the morning. And that's been true whether it was practicing law or writing novels. And so I'm smarter in the morning. I think more clearly and certainly have more energy. And that's my process as well. By 2 or 3 in the afternoon, I'm pretty well spent. And I like to get with it quickly and push on through the day and then crash pretty early in the afternoon. That's just kind of my natural tendency.
There was one other area of Mirador I wanted to explore with you because it seemed that you had brought that Mayan civilization literally to the modern day, as you wrote about the Zapata's insurrection and the birth of the World Wide Web. How were you able to tie those themes or concepts into a book about the Mayans?
Yeah, that was the challenge and the task and my desire in deciding to write that book. I've always been fascinated by the history of a revolution in Mexico. They've got a long history of that, I'm afraid. And so I've always been intrigued by those. And growing up in the 50s and 60s and being a young man in the 70s, there were books, there were movies, there were TV shows about Mexican revolutions. I was always intrigued by them. And then when the Zapatista rebellion broke out on January 1st, 1994, I thought, here we go again. I get to see this with the eyes of a more mature observer and put it in perspective. And was a very interesting phenomenon because it was regarded by historians as the first postmodern revolution, first to be fought on not only the battlefield, but the World Wide Web. And that meant that long history of revolution and change that had fascinated me was still there and it had a place in the modern world. And that really sparked my interest. So the internet came along in about 1993 And when the Zapatista rebellion broke out on 1st of January 1994, in response to NAFTA, that was the effective date of NAFTA, that it turned out that the internet was going to have a particular place and a particular role in this revolution. The Zapatistas, unlike revolutionaries before them, had the opportunity to get the word out and to communicate with the world through modern means, including the internet.
Let's turn to the most current book, Blue Wild Indigo. It seems in what I've been able to read about it so far that you have really set up a very difficult ethical dilemma that a modern day rancher has to answer inside himself. Would that be a fair assessment?
It would be. I think it was William Faulkner said in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech that the only thing really worth writing about was the human heart at war with itself. And either consciously or unconsciously, I seem to have fallen into that onto that path because that's what Wild Indigo is about: is people at war with themselves, with their own conscience, trying to do the right thing, trying to find the courage to do the right thing. I guess when you get down to it, it's kind of a question of justice. And I think that is something that runs through all of my books. In fact, someone mentioned to me the other day that all of these books seem to have to do with justice. And I suppose that's true. And I don't know that I set out to write the justice series, but justice does seem to be central to the stories in all three books. And I suppose that's natural given my education, my history as a lawyer. And we all have a pretty acute sense of right and wrong and justice. And so that's what I've tried to tap into.
That makes perfect sense to me. I guess I have written one novel. Unfortunately, I've never published it. But when I did that book, I literally closed my eyes and the whole story played out in my head. And I felt like I was just the reporter recording what was happening. What is your process? Do you see it in your head? Do you do a lot of research? What's that part of your creative process?
I do a lot of research and I really like it. For example, in the current book, Blue Wild Indigo, I did research about geography. Of course, I know the area that the story plays out in southwestern Oklahoma, but still to tell the story and to have credibility in telling the story, I need to be accurate with respect to geography, rock formations, things of the 1950s. The book is set in 1954. And so if you talk about a car or a pickup or something of that sort in 1954, then you need to know something about that. And you have to research it. Whatever your story is, wherever it's set and whatever the time setting may be, you still end up having to do research and that just to be able to craft the story. And when you do that research, prompts other research, it prompts and guides you into certain or different areas in the storytelling that you may not have anticipated. And so that research is very much a part of the creative process. And I enjoy it a lot. And yeah, I do see it playing out in my head. Sometimes you have to get up and walk across the room and try to envision how this conversation between these two people in this scene played out. Walk over and open the door and pick up the gun that's lying on the floor or something of that sort. Just envision it so you can then tell that part of the story.
I warned you if you opened a rabbit hole, I'd reserve the right to go down it. And you have opened one that I haven't thought of in a long time. And that's the geography of the state of Oklahoma. My father and my grandparents lived in Tulsa. They had I call it a cabin, but it was a weekend place near Locust Grove. I had an uncle that served in the U.S. Air Force in the panhandle of Oklahoma. I spent a lot of time on the southern border of Oklahoma. The geography of those 3 or 4 places I just named could not be more different. How could you say a few words about the diverse geography of the state of Oklahoma and how that may play out culturally in the state?
It's diverse and it's exotic and it's wild. The title of the book is Blue Wild Indigo. That's the name of a wildflower that grows in the state of Oklahoma, particularly in the southwestern part of the state. It's called blue wild indigo and it's also known as false indigo because it's not true indigo from which the dye is made. It's an imposter plant. It looks like indigo that they make the dye with, but it's not that indigo. It's something other than it appears to be. And so it's a metaphor for the people in the book and for the dilemma that they face. So there's meaning to that title and to the selection of that plant as the title. The state of Oklahoma has got anything you want in terms of geography. It has forested areas in the eastern part of the state. There are the cross timbers that run through the central part of the state, what were referred to by some early explorers as cast iron forests. They're very dense, almost impenetrable, low forests of shin oak and shinnery and post oak and blackjack and things like that. And then a little farther west, not very far, you get into flatlands, you get into the prairies. If you go up to the northwest, you get into the Glass Mountains and some of the exotic land formations, rock formations that you find in New Mexico. You go south into the southwest, where BWI, I call it, Blue Wild Indigo, is set, then you're into a semi-arid part of the state, rugged country. And I wanted rugged country to tell this story because I wanted to use some of the common tropes of Westerns, wild country, horseback chases, gunfights, things of that sort, man against not only man, but man against the elements. And so that's one of the reasons I wanted to set the book down there. So there's some very beautiful and gloriously rugged country down there. And so everything that you can imagine resides in this state.
I should have also added part of my story is working for Halliburton, so I've been to Duncan several times.
No, it was.
So you have another book that it's either in process or you're working on called, I believe, Traveltine Rim. Could you give us a hint about that one?
Yeah, it's called travertine rim.
Travertine.
Travertine is a rock which is natural to the state of Oklahoma. Being from Oklahoma, you're no doubt familiar with what used to be Platte National Park in the Sulphur, now the Chickasaw National Recreation Area. And one of the beautiful creeks that runs through that recreation area, an area that's been a recreation area for a couple of 100 years, you come across Travertine Creek. It's lined and rimmed by formations of travertine, which is a common building material used not only in Oklahoma, but other places in the world. If you go to Home Depot this afternoon, you can find travertine rock trim that you can use in your kitchen, different shades of beige, white, that sort of thing. And then one of the most prominent uses of travertine is the building of the Roman Colosseum in Rome. It's made of travertine. That's because travertine is a stout rock. It's a stout building material. And in a book that's in progress now, Travertine Rim, a body of water that figures into the story, a creek, is rimmed by travertine, which has a strong rock formation of travertine, which sustains body of the creek, path of the creek, and provides the support for it. And travertine is a metaphor for the strength of the place, the people, the culture, and the history in the new book.
Well, James, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode. But before we leave, I wanted to ask you if our listeners wanted to connect with you, find out any more about yourself as an author or your books, what would be the best place or places for them to go?
Two places. Amazon.com has all three of my books offered for sale. There's information about me there. And then I have my writer's website, which is at jamesallenjennings.com. Allen being ALEN, jamesallenjennings.com. That would introduce any interested person to me, my ancestry, my history, and the books that I've written. And so those two sources would provide just about anything that's worth knowing about me.
James, I've greatly enjoyed this. I hope that we can continue this conversation after I finish reading Blue Wild Indigo and I can take a deeper dive into the book with you.
I hope so, Tom. It's been a pleasure. I've enjoyed it.